Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. I'm Maria Kartinen and I have the great pleasure to chair this session and introduce you to Miri Rubin. Most of you have already seen and heard Miri and know much about her, but still it's a great pleasure for me to tell you about her just a bit. Miri has written several books and she's one of the most well-known historians, medieval historians in the world. And she was educated in Jerusalem and Cambridge and currently works as a professor at Queen Mary in London. Miri has written on the Eucharist, on medieval Jews, and on Virgin Mary, among other things. Miri is, as you've already seen today, she's a great person, and it's a pleasure to say that she's a great friend too. And Miri is an admirable character, and I think that personally, I think that she is the kind of professor who I think we all would like to be, a generous and a wonderful character who always has time for people and likes to talk about your things and affairs and so on. She has prepared this talk on Mary, and it will be spiced with some musical performances. And I think it's time to give floor to Miri.
Well, it goes without saying that it's lovely to be here, and I think I would be expressing the feelings of many in the room. And of course, this is a wonderfully mixed group. There are artists, there are journalists, there are diplomats. There are just speaking to a member of the public, the interested public, who said how much he enjoyed just be listening and benefiting from the expertise that's being shared here. And but nonetheless, although it's so open and so on, there is fundamentally deep structure and discipline. In fact, the organizers are quite extraordinary, and they kept us all to very, very clear coordinates in time and space and where to be where and what to do. So it's that lovely mixture of sort of the invisible discipline, but great openness and charm. Yes, we're very, very fortunate, because when I mentioned to the coordinator, Asko, that I would like to bring a CD and could I have a way of playing some music, he says, oh, actually, we're going to have live music. So there we are, choose anything you want on the Virgin Mary. Phew, I mean, can you think of the classical canon without the Virgin Mary? I mean, it's very difficult, but we managed to narrow it down with the help of the musical advisor, David Haxton, who is also going to be one of the singers, isn't that right?
Yes, that's right. Do you want to use microphone or?
I'm sorry, I forgot. You see what I told you? It totally keeps us disciplined and doing what we need to be doing. Okay. So thank you to everyone involved. And Mario kindly says that I like talking to people about what they do. It's true. I think that's the best way to learn for one's own benefit. And we've already, over that delicious lunch, we've already plotted a major research meeting for 2013-14. It's just the sort of thing that we do. In any case, so already I get the sense that over the last few days, and even just from this morning, since this morning when I've been present, that these wonderful gatherings have taught us a great deal, are teaching us a great deal about love. Love is everywhere, and yet everywhere love is different. This makes love the sort of subject that really historians have to get their teeth into. And I mean historians not in a narrow sense, but anyone who asks questions really about the specificity of place and time and change over time as well. In that sense, for example, historians feel very comfortable with the work of anthropologists or the methods of anthropologists in the attempt to understand how life worlds are constructed, meanings are constructed in people's lives, but also trying to understand how they change. So when you look at love, well, it's both reassuringly recognizable to us as we observe people in other times and places, but it is also actually very challenging because inspired by love, people can do the most extraordinarily generous, wonderful, sharing, caring things, and yet they can do hideous harm. And to some extent we saw that in the morning because the Inquisitor clearly is motivated by a love of God, by a sense of responsibility for his flock, for his sheep, and yet obviously is also operating a system that is oppressive and painful. And then there are all the different types of loves: the conjugal love, parental love, love of country, love for a cause. And as part of the now very, very lively area of historical inquiry known as the history of emotions, and here I must give a plug to the Center for the History of Emotions, which is at Queen Mary, my university, which is one of the leading institutions in Europe, and definitely the leading one in the UK. It is really quite extraordinary to see how everyone's work, almost from every area, from history of politics, history of the family, history of religion, benefits from stopping and thinking about emotions that pervade, that result from the various encounters and activities that historians have normally studied. So central to the enterprise of studying emotions and love is the consideration of the cultural language. And when I say language, I mean not just words, but images, gestures, sounds that prompted and expressed those particular emotions in their historical specificity. A gaze can be loving or full of hate. An embrace can be stale, moi, moi, when people meet, sort of thing, actors or whatnot, or full of meaning. Tears can be a sign of regret or of longing. Here is a vast field for the human sciences to explore for our shared creative and intellectual enterprises. So in this lecture, we will trace a particular mode of sacred love. It was born in Europe around the year 1000, and it has left its imprint on modern, contemporary European culture and beyond in those parts of the world where European ideas and practices have been imposed or inflicted. While it was born within the European religious culture, its meanings were far more diverse than those we would normally associate with the sphere of religion. For around the year 1000, Europe's Christian religion was the hegemonic language for all types of interactions between peoples, between classes, political entities, and within families. It permeated the public and the private spheres. It formed the framework for intellectual work and for the search for spiritual perfection. At the beginning of the second millennium, something like a European culture was shared quite widely across the continent, and it was emerging in particular centers, Paris, Rome, but actually was carried further afield, deep into rural areas, into cities, into regions that were only recently becoming Christian, or still becoming Christian. And the carriers were priests, nuns, sometimes, and monks, the intellectuals and the cultural communicators of the day. It steadily spread, this religious culture, more widely to lay people in parishes, rural and urban. And since all regions had their very own traditions, these increasingly interacted with the robust, universal, shared story. So whatever the idea is within this Christian culture, let us say, ideas about the crucifixion, there are formal pronouncements. These pronouncements trickle down to regions, and within regions there are almost local versions that are articulated. And in spreading this, in spreading this knowledge, and spreading the elements of the Christian story, it is not only the work of those professional communicators, intellectuals, writers, almost all of them within the church or in some connection with the church, but also the support of rulers, secular rulers, is really important, and actually we saw that in the piece, the operation, for example, of the Inquisition later, supported and needing that support, that muscle of the state. Well, that is very much part of the package. So that a universal Christian story was crafted to provide Christian meanings in all areas of life: love, family, community, and justice. The speed and the reach of these ideas and images varied from region to region, but the language of religion, and within it a language of love, spread widely and became ubiquitously recognizable. It was expressed in images, music, devotional poetry, and very importantly, in the words of communities, in their own vernacular languages. That's another thing that our performance showed, that there is sort of the Latin bureaucratic language, but that language interacts constantly with the vernacular of the people, of most people. And all these efforts together resulted in the creation of public images and liturgies of love. At their heart was the figure of the Virgin Mary, the loving mother. So the process that I shall delineate, which starts around the year 1000, ends up by the later Middle Ages, indeed the eve of the Reformation, in having produced something like that: the loving, nurturing mum and home, the Virgin Mary. But as ever, let us step back for a few minutes just to be reminded what had preceded this European religious culture with love and Mary at its heart. In the earlier centuries, and as Christianity spread from the Eastern Mediterranean, further north and west in Europe, communities adored, remembered, and loved the God made flesh, the Father's sacrificed Son, the figure of Christ. But alongside this overwhelming image were more local subjects for affection and loyalty. And these are, of course, saints and martyrs. Heroes often because they were martyred in the process of bringing Christianity to various parts, as missionaries, heroic missionaries. And at their tombs, to their tombs, people made pilgrimage. At their tombs, they made offerings. So that would be the story of, say, Vitale in Ravenna, Saint-Denis in Paris, Adalbert in Prague, and later Olaf in Norway or Henrik in Finland. Christianity's drama of salvation was experienced through local cults of great intensity in the first millennium, which inspired by their example, but also captured a quality of local community, of pride, and of local association. People loved their saints and martyrs above all, and made loving offerings to them at shrines, sometimes in words, sometimes in song. Religious identities and the attachments they engendered were highly local then, and above all them always hovered that strong, universal Christian story. It had been imprinted early on by an iconography and a language of imperial majesty in the Christian Roman Empire and later to become Byzantium. You will remember that the first authoritative endorsement of Christianity was that of the Roman Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century. And in consequence, and slowly throughout the 4th and definitively by the 5th century, Christianity was associated with the imperial state. It benefited from its protection. It was promoted by its armies. Its courts persecuted forms of Christianity deemed heretical or unsuitable, and the iconography of the empire became the iconography of Christianity. Indeed, the earliest surviving images of the Virgin Mary depict her as something of an empress, like this very famous late 6th century panel from the monastery of St. Catherine in Sinai, but actually probably made in Constantinople. Frontal, formal, awe-inspiring, or think of this image here in a mosaic from Hagia Sophia. Holding her son, with her son, both of them looking at the beholder. In the image before, you will have noticed probably that she's surrounded by saints and by angels, almost like courtiers around an imperial person. You'll notice that the clothing is extremely formal as well, and those of you who can sit close by will also see that at the bottom she is wearing red slippers, porphyry slippers, the slippers that only members of the imperial family can wear. She was deemed to be the protectress of the capital, Constantinople, and when it was attacked by the Avars in the 7th century, she was deemed to have actually saved it from that. Out of this extraordinary, magnificent saving by Mary came one of the most famous, probably the most famous liturgical hymn of the Greek Orthodox tradition, the Akathistos. It's a hymn of praise to the Virgin Mary, which monks said overnight, not going to sleep, not sitting down, akathistos, not sitting down, standing up, and incessantly praising her in words such as this: "To you, our leader in battle and defender, O Theotokos, I, your city, delivered from suffering, ascribe hymns of victory and thanksgiving. Since you are invincible in power, free me from all kinds of dangers, that I may cry to you, Hail, bride unwedded." Indeed, here in this image, you see Mary inserted, this is from the 11th century, between the Emperor John Komnenos and his wife Irene on the left and right of her. So what I'm trying to convey is the sense that this early endorsement of Christianity by the imperial court and with imperial ritual and decorum also marked the early representation of the Virgin Mary, the most important woman in the Christian story, was likened to and depicted as the most important women around in the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, imperial dignity. Yet in those parts of the empire where other traditions of fecund and loving and important womanhood prevailed, we glimpse just other possibilities of describing the Virgin Mary. And the example I can share with you here is that of Egypt. Because in Egypt, where there was a very powerful tradition, as there was throughout the Mediterranean, but its source was Egypt. So in Egypt, the traditions of Isis, which you see on the top left, the traditions of Isis, which was by far the most powerful member of the Mediterranean pantheon, in parallel with the growth of Christianity. The mother with her son Horus at her breast, feeding, supporting, bringing health, bringing fecundity to all those fields along the Nile. The presence of that figure of a breastfeeding mother, which existed so widely and so comfortably within Egyptian culture, meant that when Egyptian Christians came to be, they were very comfortable in adopting that language in depicting Mary, like, for example, in that image there, which is from a 7th century wall painting. Indeed, in some parts of Upper Egypt, we found, or archaeologists have found, actually temples to Isis, where the inscriptions in Greek, Soteria, Kyria, Iside, you sort of replace Isis by the vocative for Mary, Panaya, Maria, etc. So, in a way, the imperial, authoritative, hegemonic image of Mary was extremely strong, and yet to exemplify the power of the local and regional traditions, let us think of this case, where in Egypt, Mary does not look simply like a sort of a formal forbidding figure, but she is much more like the Isis heritage of a nurturing, breastfeeding mother. And it will take quite a few more centuries, and to that period that I will be discussing mostly today, after the year 1000, for Europeans to learn to represent and to feel comfortable with the idea of the breastfeeding mother. But when they got there, they were very intent on keeping it. Because most of the images of the first millennium in Europe, Western Europe, and increasingly Northern Europe as well, are very loyal, very dependent upon those early Christian imperial, let's call it, the majestic frontal mother, the image of Mary as Salus Populi in Rome here, looking very much in that Byzantine mode, or that Carolingian ivory representing Mary as a figure of ecclesia, again, frontal, majestic, sitting on an imperial throne. Or even there, around the year 800, in the very famous Book of Kells, the Insular manuscript, again, something of that Byzantine Mary is still just about the only model around. So majesty dominated the images and language of the divine before the year 1000, of the female divine, of the maternal divine. But all this was about to change. A sentimental education began to unfold at the dawn of the second millennium, and this is a story of love to which I now return. Like all cultural transformations, it began with the efforts of, and experiences indeed, of a few. And it spread through a network of encounters and influences and appropriations to many more. A language of love developed from the concerns of the religious, who devoted themselves to perfection and seclusion from worldly affairs. Love pervaded the fantasy world of those who had been given away by their families as children to become monks and nuns, who had vowed to live in celibacy and chastity in the peculiar loneliness of single-sex communities. While they devoted themselves to the love of God, they also remembered and perhaps pined for and definitely imagined all that was now missing from those lives: the maternal embrace, the family affinity with brothers and sisters, caresses and endearments. Out of their imaginings was created the Virgin Mary as a loving mother, and out of these imaginings was also made the loving, longing Son. Let us consider the nature of this milieu and of its social and cultural influences. Although monasteries were home to only a very small part of the population of Europe, they were nonetheless extremely vibrant institutions that attracted the patronage, the respect, and the aspirations of elites. They also lived in constant contact with less privileged groups of the population. Monks, sometimes monks served as priests in parishes dependent upon their monasteries. They definitely controlled vast estates and managed them. They sometimes preached on special occasions, and they received pilgrims at their shrines. There were complex and wide-reaching forms of communication between these religious institutions, their ideas and their practices, and a wide range of social groups. During the period after the year 1000, Europe experienced tremendous extension in population, in trade, in manufacture, of rural settlement, and the creation of hundreds and hundreds of new urban communities. Rulers assumed and then supported the ideas of Christian kingship and thus entered, with their peoples, into the circle of European integration. Around 1000, we have one after the other: Denmark, Hungary, Poland. Christianity offered the language, ideas, and institutional support for political entities now increasingly defined in dynastic terms. Wealth and influence were expressed and invested in the concepts of the Christian story and the possibilities it offered. Lords built churches on their estates, adorned and maintained them. Rulers joined crusades and offered the muscle, as we've seen, which supported the initiatives of the church. Patronage of monasteries offered prestige, but also really very concrete services that were unique and precious. Education, a place to put sons and daughters in particularly awkward situations, a space for retirement and for a pious old age, and above all, prayers for the dead, prayers for the living. In them, most members lived according to set routines, but some monks and nuns could really develop quite a remarkably creative intellectual and artistic life within the monastic setting. For all these reasons, the rich and powerful of Europe founded and supported, nurtured and engaged actively with monastic houses, with some 1,000 new houses founded in Europe between the year 1000 and 1200. Within them, various styles of God love were created, ranging, for example, from the style of the Order of Cluny, which emphasized elaborate liturgies, extremely ornate architecture and decoration, to that of the Order of Cîteaux, the Cistercian order, with its emphasis on poverty and relative simplicity. But all were dedicated to a life of God love, to which they were directed by their families, usually at a very young age. That would change in the century that follows this period. So family love, mother love,
sibling love, were sacrificed for the sake of immersion in the love of God, through routines of self-abasement, of work, of penance, and poverty. Clearly, for some monks, this was a life of challenging intellectual and spiritual pursuits. But it was always for monks, it was always amongst men in a world of Latin liturgy and learning. For nuns, there were a combination of Latin for some and vernacular possibilities, but nothing like the high learning that was offered regularly to monks in their homes, in their houses. There was love, of course, between monks and between nuns. Love between old and young, between monk and novice, new nun and her mistress of novices. And there were attempts to carefully monitor and control them and submit the passions to some overarching framework of God love. Above all, the domestic experience of intimacy, the nurture offered so readily by women in families and in the vernacular tongue, were denied on the whole, these striving religious, from a very early age and for a lifetime. So monks and nuns created their own mother. It is striking to witness how the heritage of the first millennium of Christian representation of mother and child incarnate underwent a dramatic shift over the decades of European growth, extension, and integration, this crucial period, 1000 to 1200. They took the traditional Mother of God, as we've seen, majestic, imperial, and turned her into a member of their own communities, a vibrant, loving figure whose purity was a lofty example, but whose unique humanity made her accessible, familiar, forgiving. We begin to notice these developments, these changes, this unique European style in the new productions surrounding the Virgin Mary in prayer and in material culture around 1000. We may glimpse it, for example, in the absolutely gorgeous Goldene Madonna, as she's called for obvious reasons. Actually, the size there is probably very close to its size in reality. Some of you may have seen it in Essen, where this new emphasis on movement and narrative begins to emerge, I always think. So we look at that image. First of all, what's very unique is it's a figure in the round. You can look around all three sides of it. And it is also a figure that is not aligned frontally, where there is this sort of twist, this sort of movement, and where the baby actually turns towards the mother. The context in which it was produced is highly significant, of course, because the statue was made for a group of nuns in their religious community in Essen, for very highly born women, with all of them, almost all of the members of this community had links to the imperial family, to the Ottonian court. Another object made for them is that absolutely glorious Matilda cross, which was made around 985, and if you just see the detail there, it has that traditional Mary there in enamel, and at her feet the supplicant, one of the religious women. And just to remind you that one of the ways in which the tradition, let's call it the earlier image of Mary, the Eastern image of Mary, this frontal image, reached and became so widespread in Europe in the first millennium is indeed through the sort of contacts that linked Byzantium and the dynastic units, particularly the empire in Europe, which were links of marriage, which were links of diplomacy, of pilgrimage, of mutual political association. And that is a milieu that's always very, very much involved or produces a lot of gift-giving of precious objects, precious religious objects often. And that is how that style became so very well known in the West. Monks and nuns invoked the Virgin Mother as patron of their institution, but also as a personal guide and friend. They imagined her efficacy through relations of love. Her son's love for her made her a particularly effective intercessor, intervener on behalf of sinful humanity. Especially, of course, since her son, out of love for her, had given her rather a special end. This is the 12th century stained glass, obviously, from France, from Clermont, But you see, Mary didn't die. Mary fell asleep and then was then assumed into heaven, where her son, where she sits to the right of her son, bride and bridegroom together. And from that privileged vantage point, she can work on the love of her son, as mums often do, and ask them to do things for them in the name of that love. For example, intercede and forgive sinful humans who approach Mary with their various requests. Building upon, and of course, in a minute we will see how this is very much infused also by the language of the Song of Songs. So within this monastic milieu then, this particular turn to Mary, and there's a tremendous amount, there are tens and tens of surviving new prayers from the 11th century, prayers composed by monks, like this one from the French Abbey of Moissac of around 1075, and the style is self-offering, self-abnegation at the foot of the Mother Mary. O blessed and most saintly Mary, always Virgin, I am thus afflicted in face of your goodness. I am greatly confused by the abominations of my sins, which have made me deformed and horrible in the eyes of angels and all saints. Only Mary can help such a wretched sinner. Building upon the rich heritage of the Bible, and above all on that love book par excellence, the Song of Songs, the language of love was made of images of beauty and fertility, water, honey, roses, dew, words and images which still occupy the linguistic repertoire of European love. The diversely creative and really quite wonderful nun Hildegard of Bingen, who died in 1179, here's a lovely image of her receiving her visions as an inspiration from on high, and then she writes them down like we saw this morning with the stylus and the wax pad. She takes down the notes from God about her, the inspiring visions that he visited upon her. Well, Hildegard of Bingen is an excellent example of a hyper talented person, of course. She wasn't usually a normal sort of run-of-the-mill nun, but she was able, within this world of monastic striving, to engage with the Virgin Mary with a particular intimacy, and with a particular intimacy with Mary's female body. She wrote antiphons for her community of nuns at Rupertsberg in the Rhineland, where she was abbess. And typically the language is of fecundity, of greenness. One of her famous antiphons is Viridissima Virgo, most verdant of virgins. In her sequence O Ecclesia, which we're going to hear in a minute, she develops the metaphor of human love as representing the relationship between Christ and the Church. The Song of Songs became an endlessly nourishing and providing source, with its imagery of loving bodies too. As the body came to the fore, so did the breast, the mouth, the arms of the beloved, allowing a whole new language of love and devotion and desire to be developed in text, sound, and imagery. So now if all works well, all I have to do is press that. O Ecclesia.
Oh
stop there and read to you just a little bit so you know, so you get the sense of what's being said. It's very much, it's literally, it's almost like a paraphrase of the Song of Songs. O Ecclesia, your eyes are like sapphire, your ears the Mount of Bethel, your nose like a mountain of myrrh and incense, and your mouth is like the sound of many waters. With a great desire I have desired to come to you and rest with you in the marriage of heaven, etc. The language of Hildegard of Bingen as she contemplated Ecclesia in the figure of Mary through the Song of Songs. So the love of mother came to express one of the cores of the Christian story. Theologians in monasteries pondered the role of Mary and emphasized her active part in the story of salvation. And this too was new, this particular emphasis. If this was a drama of love, the offering of a son by his father, then the son's mother was now a central figure too. She provided the human flesh for a saving incarnate God. Her role was emphasized as loving and giving. This was probably best captured towards the very end of the 11th century by the great theologian Saint Anselm, who argued not only cur Deus homo, why God had to become man, but also that crucially he could only become man thanks to his mum. Motherhood, a state of feeling, a state of love, was theorized, imagined, and produced in images of stark novelty. The monks of the order of Cîteaux, which I've already mentioned, one of the new orders, were attracted in particular to the image of Mary as a loving, protective mother, the Mater Misericordiae, which was to become so popular an image in the later Middle Ages. This is a figure where love becomes protection above all. I'm going to show you a series of images which are actually from the later Middle Ages when it really exploded. But this was born early in the 12th century in the Cistercian order. Mary as a mother, you see there that figure of the mother protecting, like a hen protecting her chicks under the mantle from any trouble that the world might throw at them. That's a Sienese example. And within the order of Cîteaux, within the Cistercian order, one cannot talk about it without mentioning its very greatest thinker and writer. That is, of course, St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who died in 1153, and who wrote homilies and prayers for Mary like this one. Our Lady, our mediatrix, our advocate, to your Son reconcile us, to your Son commend us, to your Son present us. Obtain, O Blessed Lady, by the grace found in you, by the privilege deserved by you, by the mercy born of you, that he who, by your mediation, deigned to share our infirmity and our misery, may by your intercession let us all share his glory and his blessedness. He, Jesus Christ, your Son, our Lord, blessed above all, forever and ever. Phew, full stop. Yes, one passionate sentence. And it's very interesting to note that a century after Bernard of Clairvaux died, a story or sort of a legend about him developed, the first witness of which is from 13th century Denmark, which is to say that Mary had given Bernard a very special gift, a gift that only a mother can give, and that is the gift of milk, the lactatio. She squirted milk at him from her breast. There it's captured, I think, extremely powerfully in this late 15th century engraving, but it is something that is described in earlier centuries as well, so that it's appropriate that he who was so devoted to her maternity, to her loving maternity, should be rewarded for that by her in the most quintessentially maternal response, milk of the breast. These images of a fecund, loving, giving mother, who was also an agent of salvation, were destined to spread widely beyond the monasteries and into the vast array of social and religious spheres. This transmission was worked through tens of thousands of encounters, of course, most of which we will never have any hope of reconstructing or even understanding. Yet we can identify some strands, or rather I have identified a few strands, whereby the new married mother love language was transmitted to wider circles. This is just a few that I chose to emphasize to give you some sense of how it might have worked. So, for example, it is spread
by monks, often of the Cistercian order, who were called to become bishops, that is, bishops in the world, with all the responsibilities to preach, to teach, to spread theological ideas, and so on. This is, for example, the case of one, Odo of Tournai, who was very much against his will to start with, but then he sort of went native. He became, from being a Cistercian monk, he became a bishop of Tournai. And one of his numerous theological writings was a debate with a Jew who rejected the Virgin, and he's compellingly trying to convince him, and ultimately convinces the Jew that Mary's body is pure, where the Jew says, a woman's body, how could she contain God within it? And so just to give you a sense of language of Odo, this language which we've seen born in the monastery, but through his agency as a bishop could spread much more widely. For example, the secret places of her blessed womb were the more holy, or rather the more divine, the more intimately divine mysteries grew there. What in all creation is more holy, more clean, more pure than the Virgin from whom was assumed what God became? O womb, O flesh, in whom and from whom the Creator was created, and God was made incarnate. So just to suggest to you one possible avenue of spread. Another one is, of course, when monasteries became these great hubs of religious interaction, when they became centers of pilgrimage. So think, for example, and some of you may have visited, be it Rocamadour in France, of course, up there, or Montserrat in Catalonia, or Walsingham in England. These are places where there's tremendous interface between the monks and their culture and the thousands and thousands of pilgrims who come to the shrine that is in their care. And there's real interaction because enclosure had to be broken in order to allow the monks to be there and register the healing miracles and hear confessions and so on. So these are real hubs of activity, and indeed the Libri Miraculorum, the books of miracles of the Virgin Mary, just as in any other shrine, then became a literary genre of its own that circulated and spread knowledge of the miracles, but also those very monks in charge of shrines often wrote materials for the use of pilgrims. Famously, there's one monk in Montserrat who was appalled by all the bawdy music and singing by which the pilgrims, passed their night sitting around the fire, and so he composed for them devotas cantilenas, sort of more devout songs for their use, praises of the Virgin Mary. It's one other trail. And music, well, that's songs, music. Music is indeed a very, very important vehicle for the dissemination of this sentimental education of Europeans. The 11th and 12th centuries saw the creation of tens of new sequences, as we saw. So the antiphons, for example, composed by Hildegard, and these were elements, the sequences were elements that were then introduced into the Mass of chanted prayers devoted to Mary. The great establishments like, say, Chartres Cathedral or Notre Dame of Paris became homes for musical activity and experimentation and innovation around Mary. So monastic music, in a way, traveled quite widely and affected also the cathedrals, which are, bang in the heart of cities, available to very many people, but also in other ways. And I've always felt that, this is a story that my dear colleague and brilliant medievalist as well as musician, Christopher Page, who, by the way, directed Gothic Voices, the recording of Hildegard that we just heard, he introduced me to this story, which is a story told by a Cistercian writer, Cesarius of Heisterbach, around 1220. It's about just an ordinary parish priest from the Diocese of Trier who spent some time in a Cistercian monastery. And he claimed that one of the greatest gifts that he learned in that monastery, or one of the great things he took away with him, was learning the Salve Regina, Abate Misericordia, sort of the great antiphon. And this hymn served him well because on his way back to his parish, after having been in the Cistercian monastery, he was caught in a storm, and it is the recitation of this antiphon that he reckoned brought Mary to his aid and saved his life. And then there's another track of dissemination of Mary love, Mary knowledge, which is of course through material culture, be it the growing number of Mary statues and representations in parish churches, like these famous early representations from the Auvergne, another one, but also something like this. This is a very famous panel. It's very small, it's only about this, and it cost about 7-8 years ago, it cost the Metropolitan Museum in New York $7 million to buy. So it's a very famous panel, but it was basically a devotional panel that some lucky person had in their house, probably to pray with. So that's another way in which sort of dissemination of Mary knowledge through the trails of material culture. But let us concentrate on music for a moment, because now we have almost now we have a very wonderful offering. Music was seen, though, as particularly suited for the articulation of Mary knowledge and for capturing the essence of Mary love. She had, after all, burst into song at the meeting, at that famous meeting with her kinswoman Elizabeth, the Visitation. And some of the most exciting and innovative experimentation with Mary knowledge, musical Mary knowledge, took place in Notre Dame of Paris, in that great cathedral, the cathedral at the heart of a city that had tens and hundreds of clerics, students, scholars, the world of, well, Abelard was already mentioned earlier, and in the early 30th century, we start getting sort of musical resources that can actually be reproduced. And one of the genres that really developed in Notre Dame of Paris is the motet. And just to remind you that the motet is this extraordinary result of combining audaciously the French pastoral or vernacular poem, which may be praising, I don't know, a shepherdess or a love object, while the tenor is exalting Mary in very solid Latin, very sort of recognizable liturgical pieces. The parts were often interlinked through alliteration. So one of the most famous ones from the later in the 13th century, Plus belle que Flos, more beautiful than a flower, that's the French bit, and then Flos filius eius, flower son. So you see how alliteration combines a vernacular chant, which might very well be profane love, with sacred love, binding them together. And as ever, the resolution is, the trick is to get it to resolve and to act brilliantly together. I often find that motets just became so utterly complex and challenging that in the end you wonder what people were able to understand. But then Christopher Page also explained to me that it really wasn't about the listeners, it was about the makers of the music, it was about the in-group of people in the cathedral who knew all the tricks. I mean, it doesn't mean that the audience like us today won't enjoy it, but there is something inside about the making of the music and the dissemination of the liturgy that was really the crux of where the intellectual emphasis was. And it's from Paris. This is the cue for our singers. It is from Paris that one of the earliest and really most important compositions, Beata Viscera, the blessed flesh, the blessed innards, the blessed fleshly bits of Mary, as it were. I'll just read to you the first two verses. Is going to be performed by a group of wonderful singers, which was led by David Haxton, who's actually English, but he's gone native and he speaks beautiful Finnish. And he's in charge of the music here, and we're going to have some at the end. Let me just very quickly remind you in translation of the words. So this is from around 1220, Beata Viscera. Blessed flesh of the Virgin Mary, at whose breast the King of eminent name, concealing under altered guise the force of divine nature, has sealed a pact of God and man. Oh, astonishing novelty and unaccustomed joy of a mother still pure after childbirth. So you get the message, you get the idea, and now you're going to get even more of an idea. Thank you so much.
Maria,
or mira novitas. Indeed, it's all these things were new in the 12th and 13th century, a real field for experimentation, the new language of marry love. We note here a very interesting move then, or what I'm trying in the last few minutes to convey to you is the move from the monastic producers to wider and wider circles, ultimately to the parish church, which is also a move from the Latin to the vernacular. During the 12th and even more energetically from the 13th century, with the coming of the new preaching orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans we already met today, religious experience for lay people was expressed increasingly in all the colour and subtlety of local languages and idioms. People were now able to learn about, pray, and discuss the loving mother in their own languages, to see the love portrayed in local materials and styles of representation that became not only familiar, but almost an emblem of locality. So, for example, oops, that was supposed to be Notre Dame for you, a Tuscan Mary, or a Parisian Ivory. So what was the content of this love language? Well, it expanded and expanded. How did the Mother of God then, darling of monks and nuns, inspiration to theologians and devotional writers, become Europe's loving mother, Europe's lover? How did a language of love offer a sentimental education to Europeans? The Christian story from birth to death and resurrection allowed for the exploration of a whole array of emotions in various media. Favourite above all was that of mother and child, as we've seen, and I shall quickly go through a number of representations in different media, early 14th century glass in England there. It is no longer that frontal seated pair. It is now mother and son touching, looking at each other, sharing a joke together, being a bit more solemn perhaps, but nonetheless really touching each other intimately, looking at each other with a delightful Gothic smile. Another version of that, a little bit more decorated with gold, or there indeed sharing the breast. Some artists found the area of the breast, well, the breast again and again, the breast to be particularly inspiring of their poetry, particularly attractive, like the poet Werner the Swiss in the 14th century. This is a Minnesänger. He's a sort of poet of love, of profane love. We're finding it increasingly hard to separate the two. But he also devoted his talents to the writing of a Marienleben, a life of Mary, where he imagined, quite again audaciously, I think, the child Jesus' appreciation of his mother's breasts. It's another. There. Two noble dates. Little apples, sweet and fair. This is Mary's breast, right? Two noble dates, little apples, sweet and fair. God saw them and came thither in search of sustenance, took them at once in his mouth with joy. Thus his love was set on fire. I mean, if I may praise it, your noble breast full of grace, beautiful, so praiseworthy, that God himself valued it above all that was ever his, lauds it with worthiness, wished to thrive and grow at it, for it was his desire to kiss it. He nestled against it, suckled it with joy, and entered into your womb, wherefore your praise will always be great. So it's some sort of scene of Jesus being at the breast makes him want to be back in the womb. Now, this is not my translation. I think it's a brilliant translation. It's not mine, it's my colleague, Dr. Jackson's. Mother and child were increasingly inserted into situations of family life. Although Joseph was not the physical father, as we would call it today, he was an active and lively part of the story. Like there. Mother, that's a 13th century representation, of course, of the Nativity. Mother, father, and son lived and worked together within settings that conveyed a traditional division of labor within the family, but also tenderness between its members. Writers and artists emphasized the different aspects of a loving family life. Joseph teaching Jesus to work, Mary teaching him to read. While the Gospels offered nothing of this kind, it's extremely little about Mary and mother love in the Gospels, as you well know, writers in the vernacular imagined these lives in terms of what was familiar, the love of the nuclear family, the love of mother and son. The cultural turn in love language was in the later medieval centuries towards the domestic and the familiar, the making of the most extraordinary religious narratives, really, akin to the everyday experiences of every man, every woman, every child. So, for example, there in the work of 2 Italian artists, we have the Mary there knitting on her own with Jesus, and Mary there in the family home, knitting again in the family, playing together, addressing each other in a very touching way. We find in this here wonderful early 15th century German carving the household Mary at prayer, and Joseph actually rather touchingly drying a diaper at the fire. We have the famous Merode altarpiece, and one could say a lot about it, but just to emphasize here, you've got Mary praying, receiving the Annunciation, and Joseph there, doing his job with an extremely highly specialized, very well observed set of carpentry tools of the early 15th century. We have here, and a family, of course, is always tested at moments of pressure and trauma in a way, and therefore very often the family is represented particularly movingly in the scene of the flight to Egypt. Here, for example, in this very recently discovered, about a decade ago, wall painting from the crypt to Siena Cathedral, the scene where on the flight to Egypt, when Mary wants to eat some dates, this is again all sort of apocryphal legend, Jesus, her son, organizes the bending down of a date tree so that she can easily avail herself of the sweet dates. Now the scene, I think, absolutely gorgeous. 15th century polychrome there carved of the flight again into Egypt, and the family is not just a nuclear family, it's reinforced by very important figures that develop powerfully in these centuries, particularly the figure of Anne. So we see here Anne teaching Mary to teach, who is then teaching Jesus to teach. It's a little bit like Russian dolls, isn't it? And there again, this figure of granny, young mother and son. Anne becomes a really, again, born in the monasteries in the 12th century, associated with the birth of the Feast of the Conception. She nonetheless becomes, in the later Middle Ages, the figure par excellence representing older women, in a sort of an older, saintly older woman, much married, lots of grandchildren, and, well, like women in medieval cities. And to treat you here, does anybody know where this is from? Hattula. Yes. Please. Mary and Anne, again, young woman, older woman with respectable sort of headgear. And again, just to show you some figures there of whole altarpieces, whole tabernacles devoted to the group, granny, mother, son, and the love that flows between them. And some painters, and that's another one of the holy kinship, the whole extended family with the women to the fore, and the various husbands, because of course Anne had 3, in the back over there, and lots of cousins, and of course scenes from Mary's life over there. That's from the 15th century, and I just could not resist this absolutely glorious early 17th century there. Italian family, Italian Holy Family. But some artists took in a different direction. I think this here brilliant panel, which I actually had the pleasure of seeing just a few days ago in the Siena Cathedral by Giovanni Fei from the second half of the 14th century. I think what's important here is that, I hope I'm not fanciful in suggesting, but he actually worked rather in emphasizing family resemblance. I think the boy is made to look like his mother. If you just take a minute to see, I think it's clear that that was a priority. So while the scenes of mother and child love, as well as the tenderness of a well-ordered household, were attractive and endearing, there was the end-of-life drama to unfold as well. The happiness of a young mother with her very special son, well, every son is special to his mum, was to turn into grief at his death. And for all that the crucifixion was, of course, the fulfillment of prophecies contained in the Jewish Bible, no mother could be imagined as being anything but utterly distraught, pained, sorrowed at the sight of her son's wounded body, the trickling of blood, the anguished face. The mother at the foot of the cross, the mother witnessing the suffering of her son, even if he was to be resurrected 3 days later, became one of the most creative sights of poetry, art, devotional energy, and popular compassion. The theological nicety, after all, the Passion of Christ was part of a divine plan for salvation, nothing to cry about, gave way to the emotional logic of compassion and mourning. To love is to suffer with the love object. Here was born one of the most powerful European images, now powerful world images, of the mother suffering over her son, the Pietà. It's a German example from the mid-14th century. It is not anchored in scripture. There's the moment when Mary is described as mourning her son, right, over his body. But rather it was conjured by the emotional intelligence of those involved in reflection on mother love, by those charged with the representation and teaching of the contents of the shared religious culture we have been examining here. Yet it emerged from a very specific milieu, which we are now able to appreciate fully, that is, the religious women of the Low Countries around the year 1300. Yes, the Pietà developed in the world of female devotions, not of nuns as such, but women who stayed within their communities while pursuing religious lives. They're typical of Northwest Europe, of the urban milieu above all, not exclusively, and they're known as Beguines, or Begijnen, right? We've all been to Begijnhofen in Belgium and Netherlands today, and bits of Germany even. They were products of the bustling urban milieu of rich towns. They were often widows, they were sometimes maidens. They created unique communities which bishops were forced to accept, of women who were not enclosed behind walls, but who walked the streets of cities in their dark habits, worked at handicraft, and served the poor. For them, and sometimes by them, these images, the earliest Pietàs, were made. They took the religious logic of incarnation and crucifixion. They took the powerful idea of the Mother of God to an extreme by asking, how did she feel? How did this loving woman experience the death of her son? The result in words and matter were a distillation of love as loss, love in loss, a mother mourning her son. Another example. The Pietà, of course, became very widely known from its beginnings in this very specific milieu. So much so that by the late 15th century, a very grand French cardinal commissioned Michelangelo to make that. But more widely, and thus more significantly, it affected the European imagination very deeply. It became the most exquisite representation of sacrifice and victimhood. It came to be cherished within narratives of nationalism and statehood. When Europeans killed and lost their young in millions during the First World War, they used this image in hundreds of parish churches to help commemorate that loss and acknowledge its emotional toll. And there they still stand, like, for example, in Belcaire, in the Aude, in France, over there. At the heart of Berlin, still today, in the Neue Wache, where victims of all wars are commemorated, there stands the Pietà, crafted so brilliantly by Käthe Kollwitz, who, of course, lost her own son in the war. That brilliant, this is just the context, and here more close by. The emotional trajectory developed in medieval Europe, later medieval Europe, continued to bear meaning not only within Catholic cultures, but also in Protestant lands. It continues to represent a quality to which people of many religious tradition, or none, can meaningfully relate. This moment of mourning was distilled away from the powerful scene of love and hate, which is the crucifixion, and which the crucifixion became in the late Middle Ages. So the crucifixion is one thing, and the Pietà is something else. It's a different type of moment, and it has its autonomy. The early medieval representations of the crucifixion, as you probably know, were fairly staid affairs. Like that, their representation from an 11th century English Psalter. It has the body of Christ, triumphant over death, sometimes has Mary and John either side, but not much else happens. But in keeping with the ever-growing, ever-spreading, ever more accessible and specific language of religion, made explicit in local tongues, as I've repeatedly said this afternoon, and accompanied by moving local images, the emphasis, the crucifixion became more and more imbued with an emphasis on the humanity of Christ, on the detail of the suffering, and the idea is not only to represent the suffering, but also to elicit a really strong response from the audience. So that's where we're going back to emotions. And as it created the loving, suffering group to the right of Christ, as here referred, of course, in the very famous panel by Duccio, it also created the other group, the group of the nasties, the groups of the bad ones, to the left of Christ, the Jews who are baying and asking for blood. So the lessons of love could sometimes morph into lessons of hate. The Virgin Mary's suffering at the foot of the cross was made in later medieval writings into a drama of torment inflicted by the Jews on Mary, Europe's love object. The Jews became the antithesis of Mary's love, of mother love, as they are over there pointing. Italian artists, poets, and writers were particularly active in realizing the implications of this dynamic. As Christ's suffering became more humanized, graphic, and pathetic, the role of the perpetrators was enhanced too, the Jews. As the son suffered so grievously, his mother's torment was all the more evident and heartrending, and those who caused her the pain were fingered much, much more sort of directly, and they became themselves not only guilty, but hated. A distinctive poetic genre developed in late medieval Italy, the laude, that is a vernacular poetic form whereby lay people organized in confraternities, in religious clubs, would, quite apart from what they did in their parish, they would meet in order to recite the poetry about the crucifixion, which was in a way the poetry, above all, about Mary. They lived it as a story of mother love and loss, and created an extraordinary testimony to imagined worlds of tenderness and emotion. The Stabat Mater is a good example of these trends that we've been discussing here. The movement from monastery to parish, from Latin to vernacular, from happy love to love as anguish. It emerged from a monastic sensibility in Latin, did the Stabat Mater, but was adopted with enthusiasm by vernacular groups of lay people, like those in Italy. And so, for example, in Or San Michele, the civic center focus of mid to late 14th century Florence, the artist Orcagna was commissioned to produce a crucifix. He painted a work in which every aspect of Christ's body is revealed. I mean, it's perhaps hard to see from back there. And this image was then accompanied also by a sort of inscription under it, which just reminded people of, with the words of the Stabat Mater, the mother stood in pain, tearful near the cross as her son hung. Her suffering, her pressed, mournful soul was pierced by a sword. Oh, sad and afflicted was this blessed one, mother of the only born. The collective chanting of Laude most often reenacted then a dialogue between Mary and her son on the cross. And sometimes it uses language that's extremely alliterative, which almost collapses into baby language, into the babble, that precious language of mothers and children. For example, in the words of the confraternity of Urbino in the 14th century, she says, "Oh son, 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 oh beloved jewel, son, who gives comfort to my anguished heart?" Or far more alliteratively in Italian, "Oh figlio, 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 oi amoroso Giglio, figlio, chi dà consiglio al cor mio angustiato?" And he in turn responds, "Mamma, mamma, you pierce my heart." In Urbino, the Marian confraternity viewed the drama of the Passion unfolding in stages. And in my translation, in these very short bursts of sentences in the local dialect, "Down the white flesh the red blood trickled. Behold the bitter life that Mary's son has had. The crazed crowd of Jews ordained in council death and destruction of the good pastor. Per la carne polita currea sangue vermiglio, or equa malavita, Cavera Maria del Figlio, while the Laudesi confraternity of 14th century Modena recited lines which directly link the Jews with the suffering of Mary. And she cried in a loud voice, "O miserable Jew, why have you tormented my sweet, sweet son? You will lose power and reward because of him, he whom the angel has told was the Son of God." So love language in these Italian confraternities deserves our attention as it juxtaposes powerfully love and hate. So the love lessons taught by and through the figure of the Virgin Mary came at a price. They valued maternity and motherhood. They introduced a humanizing aspect to the practice of religious life in monasteries, which allowed people also to rediscover their own worlds or to reimagine worlds of family and household. But they also created a legacy which is more troubling. Some of its manifestations deserve our consideration, and I shall end with 3 thoughts about the price of the language of love around Mary. The first point. Love of mother and mother love offered so richly to generations of men who were denied family life, conjugality, adult sexuality, surely was very comforting, this language, but it also, I think, stifled certain creativity and maturation. The celibate man is imagined as a child still, always Mary's child, privileged to be rewarded at Mary's breast, as we saw with Bernard. As we still aim to understand the mysteries of celibate clerical subjectivity in our own world for very good reasons, we would do well to reflect on the celibate as an infant in an enduring, unchanging relationship with his mother, who is the mother of all. This diptych, which was made in the memory of the Carthusian abbot Willem Bibot from a house of the Diocese of Utrecht around 1523, situates him in a way like a baby. Look at him and look at the Jesus, both draped in white, with pure, unwrinkled, unsullied, oval faces, children of Mary, both. Another point. The emphasis on chaste maternity was set within a system of gender relations which, while not totally fixed or uniform, was nonetheless patriarchal, of course, embedded in law and custom. While this was a rich world of emotion and subjectivity, it was also circumscribed to be domestic. When 20th century, that's why I was so fascinated today when Verpi was talking about these ladies who went off and took their clothes off. That did not happen in Europe, I can tell you, in the Middle Ages. When 20th century fascist regimes seized the maternal love language in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, it was to serve not the enhancement of mothers, but the attachment of them to home and hearth and nurture. And thirdly, the language of love mediated by the Virgin Mary imagined cruel enemies, the Jews above all, and heretics, we call them heretics, and of course later Protestants. Those who rejected the claims made about and around the Virgin Mary remained outside the circle of love, were demonized as enemies of the essence of humanity itself. In the case of Jews, of course, it also allowed the development of fantasies of great nastiness, like child murder, cruelest of crimes. So we began our journey together with the suggestion that any historical understanding of love must also embrace the possibility of change. The last point I just made reminds us that from the 16th century and for almost 2 centuries, the love object, the Virgin Mary, became the subject of harsh polemic and sometimes deadly violence in Europe, as the hegemony of medieval Christianity was displaced by the many new Christian visions. Mary was reformed, revisited, sometimes rejected altogether by those who created new understandings and identified new meanings within the religious culture of Europe. Amidst this dangerous confusion, one creative man, caught up in his own country's version of these wars of religion, composed, quite against the mood of the times, a loving anthem with traditional words to the Virgin Mary. His is a Catholic hymn in every way, reflecting his own dangerous loyalties within a Protestant kingdom, the Kingdom of England. Perhaps he, William Byrd, whose Alma Redemptoris Mater we're about to hear, perhaps he, William Byrd, dared to do so, dared to write so movingly about Mary, because actually within that very Protestant kingdom, his own sovereign and great patron, Queen Elizabeth I, Protestant queen, had actually used the Virgin image herself in order to shore up her own uniqueness, her own purity as a Virgin Queen. So let us end our reflections this afternoon on this particular subject with the word and music of William Byrd's Alma Redemptoris Mater, composed around 1605, just after the death of Elizabeth. So let me call back the wonderful singers. Fiat Musica.
Hello everyone, I hope you've enjoyed the conference today. It's been a pleasure to be with you sing. I thought I'd introduce the rest of the group as well. We have Jussi Lehtipo, Mats Lilhanus, Walter Masalo, and Andre. We're going to sing Bird's Alma Redemptoris Mater to finish off.
Mater
that I've never given a lecture where they're punctuated with live music, and it's just, thank you so much for whoever idea it was, or whoever is paying the bill, I don't know, both, all is great. It's just, it really adds something really special to have that expertise, yeah. So, do we have time for discussion a little bit? Let's go.
Yes, I hope so.
Thank you, Miri. It's been absolutely a wonderful and glorious journey into the history of Mary. Thank you. Now we do have time for questions and comments, so please ask.
Thank you very much for a very inspiring lecture. I was wondering, because many of the medieval forms of devotion, like Mary lactating on top of St. Bernard, or those words, Jesus on the breast of Mary, seem quite odd or even disturbing to us. And were there some forms or some cases in, example, lay devotion in the Middle Ages that it was considered to be too much, too overt? Yeah. Could you give some, because I've encountered only cases where not believing in Mary was decent, but could you believe too much?
Yeah, I was thinking about it when Elvira was doing her part, Greta, and about the Virgin Mary was a bit dodgy. And of course, you're absolutely right that there was quite a long tradition, really long tradition, well, very early medieval tradition of, from patristics, what am I saying? There's always been a tradition that found it very uncomfortable, the explosion of stories on Mary that are not in the Bible, for reasons that are fairly obvious. And actually, not to be an apologist, but actually the stories about Mary's life, the non-gospel ones, are extremely early. They're already in papyri of the early to mid-2nd century. So clearly, very, very early on, the concept of a mother of God led to some logical questions if you try to reconstruct in your mind, which is a big leap of the imagination, into the sort of Jewish Christian communities, what sort of conversations they're having. Okay, if he is the Messiah, it is his mum. What sort of mum was she? Did she come from a good family? Did she come from... so in a way, these are the questions that the early stories on Mary's life are there to answer. She did come from a good family. She was cherished as a child. She was kept pure. She was offered to the temple, etc., all these bits. So there's a level in which a lot of the extraneous stuff, the stuff that Luther would then totally demolish and throw out while he kept the scriptural bits, nativity, annunciation, visitation, that stuff is actually very, very early. So as a historian, not as perhaps as a Catholic theologian, but as a historian, you would say, actually, this shows that this totally belongs within that cultural milieu. So even throughout the Middle Ages, there were those writers who felt less comfortable with using those materials. A wonderful writer of homilies like Elfridge, Jean Gerson goes into a church in 15th century Paris where he sees a statue of Mary, and when the statue opens, inside there's a painting of the Trinity, as if the Trinity was born in Mary. Now, Mary is everything, Mary is, you can play around with it. Of course, I could write an essay why it's okay to say that the Trinity is born in Mary if I was pressed to. But clearly he felt this was misleading, and he writes to complain about it. But even more strikingly, there is an image around 1300 in London that draws a lot of pilgrims and comers and visitors in one of the parishes of London, and the Bishop of London decrees for it to be taken away because it's too exciting, because it's too graphic. We don't know exactly what was in it. So clearly there is a constant visiting and revisiting of the contours of acceptable devotion, where the dilemma is always this. You want to allow what encourages devotion, of course. But you don't want to allow people to fall into error out of their sort of ignorance, or taking things to the logical conclusion and thinking that it's the picture that speaks, or it's the statue that does miracles, etc. So there's always dilemma, and I would say that this church sort of church leaders never settle on this. It's a question of temperament, it's a question of as to who will come down on which side. And this is true not only about Mary, but also on other aspects of how to represent Christ. And just the last point would be to say that in the very early 16th century, there is a movement, there's some lobbying going around Pope Julius II to create a feast that celebrates the spasm, that fainting of Mary at the foot of the cross, because it's such a powerful moment in the representation, as we saw. So he does what you do. You send out, for opinions from experts. And he gets a whole array. He gets those, yes, the people love it, it's very moving, why not? And he gets theologians who are appalled by the notion that Mary fainted at the foot of the cross. Mary is full of wisdom, Mary is full of prophecy, Mary knows what's happening. She hasn't fainted at the foot of the cross. So do you see what I'm saying? I mean, it is absolutely hard. It's not about late medieval corrupt Christianity. It's a dilemma that it's the heart. Once Christianity becomes a religion for all, how far can you go with this language and these images?
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. First, I was thinking about another matter about these different images of Virgin Mary. I was in Mexico a few years ago, and the black Virgin Marys. Do you have something to tell us about the black images, and when did they start, and so forth?
In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I had one at the very, very top. Let's just quickly run back. But it's from Bolivia, but it's almost there. Almost there. She's not black, but she's from Bolivia, but she might have been. Yeah, whatever. So, are you asking specifically about the black Madonnas? Okay. Well, first of all, there is a whole world that probably some of our experts on contemporary religions are aware of what to do with the black Madonnas. Are they, because they're common in parts of France and parts of Italy, when we're talking about Europe, and then from there they travel to, they're in the area of the Auvergne and in some parts of Italy. And there are some people who devoted their whole lives to this, and they see these sort of deep signs of autochthonous, pre-Christian wells of stuff coming through, quintessential mother, African mother. You can imagine that it's mobilized in various ways. To my understanding, and what I found the most pervasive was that at least in the Auvergne, it is very possible to relate them to pre-Christian female statues of goddesses that were indeed made in either painted dark wood or made in dark stone. So there you see, it's almost like the Isis and the Mary. You see local traditions, but then once it becomes reified, it becomes something that people know about. So the Montserrat as well is a dark one. So when the Montserrat travels in, images of her, copies of her to the Hispanic world in the Americas, that is the way. So I don't think it's about absorption of some sort of local tradition. But what I would say is, of course, that Mary is totally black in Ethiopia. The wonderful, wonderful art of Ethiopia, which is a vibrant empire in the 14th and 15th centuries, she's black and she looks like an Ethiopian woman. And if you just look at this, which is a Sino-Spanish one from the 18th century, you see again the involvement of common local features and so on, even in the traditional setting of the Mary. But since you're interested in Mexico, I would just say that the greatest Mary nowadays is, of course, in numbers and in terms of sort of marketing and stuff that you could buy on the internet, is, of course, the Virgin of Guadalupe, which is, of course, a sort of indigenous form of imagining Mary, which is in the 16th century, but really takes off in the 17th century, which combines, the visions of the Guadalupe occurred in a place which was where worship of indigenous female goddess took place, and it's combined with imagery from the Immaculate Conception. So it's one of those typical imbrication or bricolage, which is already something we talked about earlier today, that make that. It's an extremely, extremely, extremely interesting area. Thank you for raising that.
Thank you for delivering such an interesting lecture. It was extremely rich and informative. But Well, I draw on quite fragmented knowledge, so I think that probably my question, you can sort of...
Don't apologize.
But I would like, I'm just asking out of curiosity. Against the background of the transformation of the representation, Mary's representation in the European context, I was also thinking about Orthodox tradition, Orthodox Christianity, because I think that the way the image of God's mother, or the mother of God, has been evolving in the Orthodox Christianity, it offers a different story.
Absolutely, absolutely.
In compared to what you have presented.
Totally, yes, absolutely. I mean, in a way, I sort of, I didn't, well, just a trick, but what I did was, I started the Eastern Mediterranean and then I looked at Europe, because that was the subject that we organized here to do. In my case, that's what I offered. But I mean, in the Orthodox tradition, of course, to the Orthodox tradition, there's another tradition that nobody ever talks about, or not very much, and we ought to, and that's, of course, the Syriac tradition. The tradition of Christianity of those Christians which after the 7th century are living under Muslim rule on the whole, in Copts in Egypt, but Syriac-speaking people in what is Palestine, Syria, Iraq, even unto India of today, which have a totally different set of images, and already at the time of Constantine were very alienated from this type of incarnational emphasis on the equality of the divine and the bodily, and the divine and the human. And they very much less emphasize the mediation of the body and the medium of the body. They feel very uncomfortable with it. So they're very interested in Mary, they're very interested in divine wisdom through Mary. They use images like fire and light, but none of this business of breasts and wombs and bodies and hands and fruit and so on. It's alien, it's very uncomfortable. There are lots of good reasons, because these are areas where Christianity really arose out of big Jewish communities in Mesopotamia and so on. There are lots of good reasons why that's the case. But it has a very, very different tenor. And of course you can imagine also when for centuries and centuries these Christians live under Muslim rule, then the whole issue of developing an iconography and visuals is just simply not an option very much. It's very, very limited. So there's that story as well. There is of course the story of Byzantium, which is a really different trajectory, but where it really can intersect very well with my story here is in those countries that face both ways, like Hungary, like parts of Balkans, where the influences totally meet and totally converge, or a place like Cyprus even, because of the coming of, or Crete, where you have the Venetian Latin European upon what was sort of Byzantine indigenous Christianity. So I absolutely agree with you, it's a massive, massive area, but never did the exploration of the day-to-day life develop in the same way as in Europe, to the extremes of, Mary feeding porridge to the little Jew. It never went to that level of absorbing the vernacular, parish-based experience. And there are all sorts of ways of explaining that. Just like the whole story of the sacraments and the Eucharist is a totally different one. I mean, it is a story to be told, and there are people who are telling it, absolutely. It's just not my story today.
Can I just comment? I've been thinking about the Finnish Orthodox Church, which has been very much influenced by the Russian Orthodox Church. And to my knowledge, there are hundreds of images of the Virgin Mary, of the God's Mother, and there are both this kind of imperial, majestic representations of God's Mother, but there are also vernacular or sort of everyday, more representations of Mary which are very close to sort of kind of everyday life.
That's much later.
Okay,
That's much, much later, 16th, 17th, 18th century, you're absolutely right. But I will show you also something that, it's probably the Russian images from the later Middle Ages, they're not like this quite, but they tend to be more that sort of Byzantine type mother looking at son. That like the Madonna of Novgorod, the very famous one. That tends to be the tradition. No, I mean, everything you're saying is really about the way in which these universal images intersect with local cultures, with local colors, with local materials as well. And it's totally an exploration that needs doing. And I think people are starting to do it. Of course, one needs also sort of languages and local acquaintance with parts of the world that I just haven't gained yet. But it's definitely to be done. It's a very open area. What's very striking about the Finnish one, since you mentioned, albeit not the Finnish Orthodox, but just the Finnish sort of Catholic and later, well, Catholic medieval, is that it's the whiteness of it. It's the absolute white, well, you all know, I don't have to tell you, those fantastic churches. Raisio, is that how you pronounce it? Raisio, Hatula, that whole bunch of places. Lohi, I don't know how you pronounce this, Lohji? Lohja. All these places which I've actually visited and checked and seen and all that. It's always on the basis of a sort of a white background. There's far less pigmentation. There's far less, as opposed, say, to the Danish ones, which I've also seen. So it's a sort of a very different palette. The churches inside look very different. And again, this is something that needs sort of exploration. What is the effect of it? What is the effect of it when it's interacting with candlelight, with music, with sound? So I offer subjects in the, where's Mario? Okay, a PhD for one of your students in cultural history. Absolutely. The sensory ensemble of the late medieval Finnish church. It's there to be done. Yes, sorry, you waited so long.
No, not at all. Thank you so much for that. You've touched on this growth of mother love and the language and emotions and music and art that develops along this. The other relationship, which is interesting and possibly even dodgier, is that relationship between God and Mary, when Mary is so attractive. I'm thinking of that extraordinary passage by Bernard of Clairvaux, and it's God looking down on Mary and thinking, oh my goodness, she's lovely. Yeah. And you think, really, Bernard, go have a shower. It's very extraordinary. And I wondered to what extent that relationship was speculated upon when the language of love develops in this period.
I'm not sure if the word speculated is quite right, because there isn't an element of tentativeness about it. There is an element of going for it. There is an element of exploring it to its fullest extent. It's God who kisses her and embraces her and yearns for her and dies. It is not speculation. I would say there's a sort of, some sort of question involved or doubt. There is a total, nothing is not said. Well, I thought it was quite extraordinary also with Jesus and Mary's breast, quite frankly. Although I've read it 20, 50 times, I always am taken aback. So, yes, but the interesting thing is, and again, the greatest explorers of the Song of Songs, qua material for Mary-Jesus relationship, are the monks. From the 12th century, it's a monk, Rupert of Deutz, was the first one who goes the whole way and saying, folks, you got it wrong. The Song of Songs is not a metaphor about God and his church. It's about Jesus and Mary. And then they take great delight, and often in the music they unfold it in a very sort of extraordinary, like a litany, she is daughter, she is bride, she is lover, she is sister, she is every one of these relationships enfolded and all of them together. So yes, it's an extremely, extremely rich terrain, and then in turn, it is adopted and used to represent conjugal relations as the ideal marriage or the ideal conjugality, as it were. But yes, it is mind-bogglingly rich. Absolutely, yes.
In the spectrum of women in the Bible, there is Mary at one extreme and then Eve at the other extreme. Are they ever presented together, or are there any connections?
Yes, indeed they are. They are in a number of extremely interesting ways. And first, to go back to the Syriacs, for example, they loved that. They were the first ones to really run with Eve-Mary opposition, Eve giving birth to Mary, making Mary necessary. They loved that sort of soteriological story with Mary at its heart. And the image-wise, it's extremely interesting. Image-wise, you will get it, for example, in representations of the tree of Jesse, the genealogy of Christ. Jesse, father of David, the house of David, and ultimately all the generations up to Mary and Jesus. At the bottom, often, as it were, in the earth from which the tree of Jesse grows, you will see Adam and Eve there. necessitating the growth of this tree of salvation, as it were. You have, there's an amazing image from the 15th century from a missal from Augsburg, where Mary, dressed beautifully in blue as usual, and Eve, naked and voluptuous, standing either side of a tree. And the part of the tree by Eve has skulls as its fruit, growing off the tree, skulls. And the ones on the side of Mary is lovely Eucharistic wafers with the cross on them. So this is very creatively played with, as you can imagine. And by the 15th century, there are also plays that actually have a figure, a religious drama, a figure of Eve who says, oh, come along, Mary, I have created you, I've made it necessary for you to come along. Yes, it is more and more explicit. Yes, absolutely right. It is definitely there. Just like we get very early on Adam's skull, as it were, at the foot of the tree of the cross. You get Eve in various contexts with Mary. Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
When I think of divine mother imagery in comparative perspective, I'm thinking about sort of the classical world or the Indian world. You have the regal imagery, of course, and you have the fecund sort of mother imagery, but you also have the martial imagery, Athena or Kali. Do we see any of that with Marian imagery, or is that just missing?
It's a really interesting question. I would suggest there is something of leadership and authority in Maria's ecclesia over there. It's a version, but far more explicit, and indeed my colleague Amy Rubin is just publishing a book called Maria Conquistadora, which is the name of a cult you may know from, I think it's New Mexico or Texas or both, which goes back to Spanish roots, which is Mary as the leader of the Reconquista against Islam, banners with her, and when Cortés comes over, again, we're back in Mexico, the banners with the Virgin Mary leading this crusade, as it were. And you might say also the aggression of Mary against the Jews, in as much as in miracle stories where she either converts the Jew, or she increasingly towards the later Middle Ages, the Jew ends in a bad end, which she has miraculously brought about. So Mary can be quite, there's all this, the mild mercy, but her enemies are up against a formidable power that does indeed punish and does indeed, yes, but the inspiration for good violence, as it were, for just violence, is definitely there. Absolutely, yes.
Oh, well, this is a bit of backtracking, but I might have misunderstood you when you talked about the whiteness of the Finnish churches.
Of the Finnish churches.
Yeah. Because the medieval Finnish churches were brilliantly painted.
No, I don't mean that they're whitewashed. I mean the background.
The background.
And the painting is against a white background, which you would hardly ever find in an English church, for example. Have I got that wrong?
That's right. But there are churches where they fill almost the whole church space.
Yes.
Paintings, yeah. And but you were talking about the background.
Yes, I'm talking about the background, yeah, which struck me. Another thing that struck me since you're here, and you probably obviously know this area. Remember when I showed the Mater Misericordiae? That one. Mm-hmm. We have a number of versions, is it from Finnish? Definitely from Norwegian churches, and I have a feeling also from Finnish ones. And there, all the souls of the people, all these people here, believers of various descriptions, men and women, lay and priests, they're naked. They're naked. They're like souls. They're not like people here where everybody has the clothing according to their estate. I remember at the time it struck me, and I looked at a book that was all about, and it's true, that this is a version that's totally unique to Norwegian and Finnish churches.
Yeah, probably Sweden also.
Yeah, I don't know about that, but yeah. So again, these themes are to be found all over Europe, and then they're found in their local specificities, what seems to people right locally, or a local model that then just gets endlessly recopied. And I think that's true for almost all the big themes of Christian culture, this sort of tension between universally recognizable and yet locally quite intimately specific.
To go back to the theme of Eve and Mary, I just remembered a quite peculiar Middle English carol that praises the moment Eve felt the sin, because if she had not eaten the apple, Mary would never been heaven's queen.
Yes, it's turned into this bizarre sort of felix culpa. Isn't it great that there was a sin, because it allowed this whole great story of the incarnation and salvation to take place? No, you're absolutely right. I mean, well, the imagination revels on contradiction and conundrum, doesn't it? I think that must be it. It's not that people really think felix culpa, but it's a lovely thought to seize for a moment in order to think yet again, to revisit the issue of the Christian story. Yeah.
It's an excellent example of positive thinking, I think. Anyone else? Still have time?
A short comment on the Eve and Mary. There is these medieval Catholic jokes, these words who are turned around. Eva becomes Ave and Roma becomes Amor and things like that.
Yes.
And I have heard an English carol that they sing from Eva comes Ave, and that's Ave Maria.
Absolutely.
Yes, and Maria made good, that Eva made bad.
And there's another way in which you're quite right about playing with words and initials, because Chaucer, and not only Chaucer, but Chaucer is a good example because we all know him. Chaucer wrote a poem, and every verse of the poem begins with a letter of the alphabet from A, B, C, and each verse extols Mary according to that letter. So A is, in fact, as you say, Amo, B, Beata, C, Caritas, D, Dilectio, etc., etc., A, Eva, and he goes through the alphabet like that with the Latin word, and then he gives a little exposition in English. Yes.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for listening and being here and enjoying the performance, I have to say, and everything. It's time for coffee now, but before that we are going to thank Miri again. Thank you.